All righty. So today we're going to talk about how we end up with the United States Constitution, the creation of a new nation. So during the American Revolution, we created a form of government known as the Articles of Confederation. And essentially, it treated the 13 states as 13 independent countries, and nothing really got done. There wasn't an executive branch. There wasn't a federal army. There wasn't any way to collect any taxes. The states were supposed to give some of their tax money to the federal government. Sometimes that happened, sometimes it didn't. As a result, the federal money, what was known as continental money, was pretty much worthless. States began printing their own money. The states don't like each other. They absolutely didn't like each other. There's a real geographical divide between the North and the South. South, of course, has slaves. Their economy is dependent on slaves. North economy is dependent on manufacturing and shipping, trade. Um, so there's just this all sorts of problems. So they create this government, Articles of Confederation, which is extraordinarily weak, and eventually they find out it doesn't work. Right? You have Shays' Rebellion, where a bunch of angry farmers in Western Massachusetts try to stage a revolution against the Massachusetts government, protesting high taxes. Massachusetts is unable to defend itself against these farmers and asks the federal government to come help them. Federal government doesn't have an army to send in to help them to put down this rebellion of angry farmers. And what essentially when it excuse me ends up happening is the merchants and the wealthy in Massachusetts end up hiring their own army to put down this rebellion, and this convinces everybody this is a terrible form of government. Let's see if we can fix it. So they meet in Philadelphia in 1787 to see what they can do. All right. There are 55 men that meet there. There's no women. All of them are from the 13 states and all show up to fix the Articles of Confederation. All right, what do these 55 men look like? Excuse me. 21 are lawyers. 13 have some sort of law education. And back then, to be a lawyer didn't take much. You maybe took some law classes. You mostly read a lot of law books and called yourself a lawyer. So 21 are full-fledged practicing lawyers. 13 has some sort of law education, meaning they've probably read some law books at some point in time. 7 are merchants. They own some sort of shop or shipping company. 18 are farmers. And these are not, we're not talking about just little tiny farmers. We're talking about men with large tracts of land growing lots of different crops. 19 owned at least one slave. All right, so who's there? Well, Benjamin Franklin is there. Benjamin Franklin is extraordinarily old at this point. Um, he's got gout, which is an inflammation of the joints, and he's in a lot of pain. This will be his last gasp in American history. This will be the last thing that he does before he deep sixes and goes toes to Jesus. James Madison, who is known as the father of the Constitution. He is the one who's kind of running the Constitutional Convention. He's the one that comes up with a lot of the ideas that go into the crafting of the Constitution. Alexander Hamilton, who is a lawyer in New York, who is a brilliant writer and also extraordinarily good with money in economic theory. Then the most well known is George Washington, who was the American commander in the American Revolution, of course, leads the colonies to a victory of sorts over the British Empire. Remember, we don't really win. Britain just kind of quits. But he's the best known and most respected person at this convention, and probably the best known and most respected person in the colonies. He's certainly the wealthiest. If you take George Washington's wealth at that time, he is far and away the wealthiest person in the colonies and one of the wealthiest people in the Western world, in the known world at that time. And when he eventually becomes president, I hope I didn't spoil anything there. He does become president. When he does become president, if you were to transfer his wealth from that time to today's money, or take today's money and transfer it back to the value back then, he would be the wealthiest president we've ever had. Extraordinarily wealthy, very well respected. He is a legend, truly a legend in the country at this time. Who's not there? Perhaps this is more interesting, as who is not there. John Adams is not there. John Adams is a very well-known patriot. He was very instrumental in the American Revolution. He is a lawyer out of Boston, an extraordinarily intelligent person, one of the principal figures in the Declaration of Independence. He was one of the authors, one of the people who helped bring about the ideas in the articles, in the Declaration of Independence. Very, very, very intelligent, very, very well thought of person to a degree. He's respected, I guess. He's not really liked because he's not a likable person. People find him too arrogant and think he talks too much. But he's not there. John Adams is not there. John Adams is the American ambassador to England at this time. How would you like that job? We just beat them, or they just lost, is probably a better term, in the American Revolution. They were humiliated by their own people who have nothing more than pitchforks and some muskets and no money in a war. England loses this war. Incredibly humiliating for England. John Adams gets the pleasure of being the American ambassador to England right after that. Not a good job. Thomas Jefferson is not there. Thomas Jefferson is certainly the most educated, probably the most educated person maybe in the world at that time. Thomas Jefferson read constantly, and he read about everything, and he was fascinated by everything. And he's an extraordinarily good writer, much like Alexander Hamilton. He's the principal author of the Declaration of Independence. He's not there. He's the ambassador to France at this time. Who, by the way, he really, really, really likes France. Really likes France. All right, so they start looking at the Articles of Confederation. The original plan at the convention is to fix the Articles of Confederation so it'll work better. And eventually the 55 delegates there determine it can't be fixed. It is beyond repair. We've got to completely tear it apart and start all over. So they decide we're going to create a new government. And immediately there are problems. Large states, like Virginia, states with a lot of people in them, want representation in the national legislature to be determined by population. The more people you have living in the state, the more representation you have in the government. That made sense to them. However, smaller states, like New Jersey, that don't have as many people, don't like this idea at all. Because they think, well, all that's going to happen is that this government's going to do whatever the big states want to do because they'll have all the political power in the government. They'll have all the representatives. They can do whatever they want. And the small states say, no, population should be equal. Everybody should get the same number of representatives in the government. And that way, no one state will get too much power. Well, large states, populous states like Virginia, don't like that idea. Virginia says if we go with equal representation, we might leave this convention and leave us without any government. Less populous states like New Jersey say if we go with population based or representation based on population, we're going to leave because they'll have all the power and we'll have no power. So this whole thing is about to fall apart before it even begins. In comes James Madison, who desperately wants to create a new government. James Madison comes in and he's going to strike what he calls the Great Compromise. And here's how the Great Compromise works. There's going to be a bicameral legislature, meaning there will be two houses to the national legislature. In the Articles of Confederation, it was a unicameral legislature, meaning there is one house. James Madison says we'll have two houses. And each house, each part of the legislature will have their own things that they're responsible for. One house of representation will be equal. All states will get the same number of representatives. The other house, representation in that house, will be based on population. The more people you have, the more representatives you'll have in that house in the legislature. Okay. Each house is going to have their own separate and special powers from each other. Each house will do different things. One house will be able to raise taxes. One house will be able to approve judges and things like that. The house based on equal representation will be known as the Senate. The house based on population will be known as the House of Representatives. Where does he get these crazy ideas from? I know. From England. This is the exact same setup England has. They have one house called the House of Lords, and then they have a lower house called the House of Commons. House of Commons representation is based on population in these different regions and areas of England. House of Lords, every region gets the same number of representatives in the House of Lords. Oh. So the people they just fought and said they didn't like, they're using ideas from them. Hokey smoky. And then James Madison decides what we need is to have several different branches of the government. We're going to have a legislative branch, and these people are going to be responsible for passing laws. And they're going to be responsible for spending the money. They're going to be the ones to figure out how to spend the tax dollars. And the legislative branch is going to be made up of the two houses of the legislature, the Senate and the House of Representatives. And then we're going to have an executive branch, something that the Articles of Confederation did not have. And the executive branch will be made up of the president and the vice president and his advisors. And they'll be responsible for creating foreign policy and negotiating treaties and making sure that the laws that are passed in Congress are enforced. And then we'll have another branch, the judicial branch. And this is where the laws will be heard and court cases will be heard. And the judicial branch will rule that if laws are constitutional or not. And so and all of these branches will have power over the other branches. The legislative branch will have power to check the power of the executive branch so it doesn't get too powerful. The executive branch will have checking power over the legislative branch to make sure that doesn't get too powerful. Judicial branch has the ability to check both the executive and the legislative branch to make sure they don't get too powerful. So they have these checks and balances to make sure that no one part of this government gets too powerful, which is exactly what why we fought the revolution in the first place. We felt that the English government had far too much power. Now, where does this crazy idea of three branches of government come from? A legislative, an executive branch, and a judicial branch. If you said from England, you would be right. There is the legislative branch in England, the House of Lords and the House of Commons. There is the executive branch in England, which is at this time shared by the king and by the prime minister. And then there is a judicial branch in England, where the judges hear court cases and determine if laws um, fit within the English rule of law. Holy cow! So now we've got some sort of government set up that sounds like maybe possibly it could work. And then, just as things begin rolling along, there's a problem. Slavery. The South, which doesn't have anywhere near the population that the North has, South has very few people living in it, very few white people living in it. So the South is very worried about the North getting more representatives in Congress because there is a growing and fairly powerful abolitionist movement in the North. And the picture that you see here, right here, I am not a man, am I not a man and a brother, is a what would you call it? Piece of propaganda, I guess, put out by the abolitionists in the North. This was a stamp that they would put on paper and so on to spread the word of abolitionism. So the South is very worried about the North having all the power because they've got all the people. And they're worried that the North could begin passing anti-slavery laws. So the South wants to kind of counter that power of the North. So they want their slaves to be counted as part of their population for representation in Congress. And in some cases, the North or portions of the South would have more representatives than areas in the North if they count the slaves, because there's a lot of slaves in the South. Most Northern delegates are against this. They think this is ridiculous. They tell them, you view them as property. You cannot count property as people. You got to do one or the other. Either they're people and they have rights as people, or they're property and you treat them as property, but you can't treat them as both. The North tells them, we are not going to count your slaves as part of your population because you don't see them as people. South gets very offended. South says, well, if that's not going to happen, we're going to leave and just go home. And again, this convention is about to fall apart just when things seem to be going along well. The South now threatens to leave the convention and go off and do their own thing. James Madison is very worried about this because he knows the South is a very, very important component to the well-being of this nation. The South is where all of the cotton comes from. The South is where a lot of trade goods come from. We need the South. So he wants the South to stay. So he comes up with a compromise that will make the South happy and also address the concerns of the North. And it's called the Three-Fifths Compromise, a very bizarre ruling. Essentially, every slave in the South will be counted as 3/5 of a person for representation in Congress. Essentially, what they're saying is that it takes 5 slaves to count for every 3 people. So they're not going to be counted as a whole person, which would be 5/5. They're going to be counted as less of a person, 3/5. Oh boy. And that's how they'll count them in a population. makes the South is not thrilled with this because they wanted them to be counted as a whole person, but at least they're getting something out of it. The North is not real happy with this because they don't want the South to get representation in Congress. And they also find it ironic that the South wants to count something that they believe is to be property in their population. But if it'll save this convention, the North is willing to take it. So now we have this Constitution written. The next step is it has to go out to the states, and it has to be ratified by 9 of the 13 states. So each state legislature has to vote yes or no on this new convention or on this new constitution. Otherwise, we don't have a government. So this constitution now begins to go from state to state to state to state for the legislature to vote on. And immediately, there are some real divisions that begin to spring up around this new government, this proposed new government. There are two groups of people. There are the Federalists, who want a strong central government as outlined in the new Constitution. And then there are the Anti-Federalists, who a lot of them like the Articles of Confederation and think it just needs to be tweaked a little bit. And then there are others who believe that the current Constitution as it's written gives the federal government too much power. And so as the Constitution goes from state legislature to state legislature to state legislature, the Federalists and the Anti-Federalists are against this new Constitution, the Federalists are for it, they begin to write a series of essays, essentially letters to the editor, to each other, at each other, that would show up in the state newspapers, wherever the Constitution was for consideration. They would write these letters to the editor, to each other, and make their cases for why that should or it should not be ratified. And these are known as the Federalist and the Anti-Federalist papers. So the Federalists, they write a whole bunch of essays to support the Constitution. Anti-Federalists do the same thing. Okay? The Federalists believe that that these essays, their purpose of writing these essays is to show how the Constitution is going to solve a lot of the problems that we have with the Articles of Confederation. Okay? Anti-Federalists, they don't like the Constitution for a number of reasons. One, most of the Anti-Federalists are against slavery, and they don't like that slavery is allowed to continue. They are pro-states people. They are against strong federal governments. They want the states to have most of the power, and they fear that most of the state power that states had in the Articles of Confederation will be lost. They believe that if we have a strong federal government, Anti-Federalists believe we have a strong federal government, it will begin to trample the rights of the people. Anti-Federalists say we need a Bill of Rights to protect the people from the government. We have the Constitution talks about all these things that the government can do, all these powers that the government has, but there's nothing in there saying what the government should not do. And Anti-Federalists want a Bill of Rights that outline very specifically the rights of citizens. Okay. The Federalists are led by Alexander Hamilton. There's 85 essays that they write. Alexander Hamilton writes over 50 of these essays. Whew. And as the Constitution goes from state legislature to state legislature to state legislature for ratification, the Federalists and Anti-Federalists are writing these essays back and forth at each other, answering each other's criticisms, answering each other's questions. And it appears in local newspapers. All right, so let's get to it. The ratification process. 9 out of 13 states have to ratify the Constitution. Okay? We need a supermajority of the states to ratify. If 9 out of 13 states ratify, we've got a government. We've got a government under the Constitution. If a state chooses not to ratify, then that state essentially can become its own nation and hey, good luck surviving. Figure things out for yourself. All right, so right off, here we go. Delaware is the first state to approve it. December of 1787, the Constitution shows up. Delaware says, yes, we're in. On Delaware's license plates, still today, it says first in the nation. That's what it means. They were the first to approve it. Delaware is just looking for attention. This is a way to get it because nobody ever pays attention to Delaware. They're followed by Pennsylvania. That's a big state. New Jersey, Connecticut, Georgia all follow. So now we have 5 states. Oh, gosh, we're a little over halfway there. Yay! North Carolina and Rhode Island vote against it. Oof. North Carolina hurts. Rhode Island, Rhode Island. Rhode Island does lots of weird things, by the way, to get attention. They're very attention starved, so they just kind of act out. New Hampshire says we're going to wait and see how this plays out. New Hampshire doesn't want to stick its neck out and say yes or no. So New Hampshire passes when the Constitution comes to them. They're going to wait and see how this plays out. So we're still at 5. We've got 5 that have voted for it. We've got 2 that have voted against it. Maryland, pretty important state. They approve it. We're at 6. Yes. South Carolina votes for it. Woohoo! So now we're at 7. Massachusetts, a hotbed, the seat of the Revolution, barely approves it. In Massachusetts, big problem with the Constitution is that it doesn't have a Bill of Rights. So we're at 7 states now. New Hampshire approves it. New Hampshire goes, oh, I think this is going to work. So New Hampshire votes for it. So now we're at 8. 2 really important states that if we don't get these states to go with it, regardless of what happens, this is not going to work. These are the 2 most important, the 2 richest, the 2 most politically powerful states in the Union. Virginia and New York. Virginia approves the Constitution. Yay! We've got a government. We've got it. That's 9. New York approves. Holy cow, this is working out great. North Carolina realizes, we can't be a country of North Carolina. So they finally approve in November of 1789. Not going to work real well. And Rhode Island joins. And nobody noticed or cared. Rhode Island. All right. So then we need a new president. We need our first president. Once the Constitution has been ratified, we go about finding our first president. Well, it's pretty obvious who it's going to be. George Washington is the most obvious choice out there. I mean, how could you not choose George Washington? Look at that face. Who could say no? He's a war hero. He's the wealthiest man by far in the country. He's the most respected person in the nation, respected not only by the Americans, but respected by foreign powers. This is a no-brainer. So George Washington agrees to run. He's a shoo-in. Who would run against him? John Adams would. John Adams believes he's just as good as Washington. People can like him as much as they like Washington. They can't, but he thinks they can. So he briefly runs against George Washington. He truly believes he could beat George Washington. He realizes very quickly that he can't. There's no way John Adams is going to beat George Washington at all. And Washington is unanimously elected president. He will be the first president unanimously elected. He is going to be the last president to receive every single vote. Adams, because technically he comes in second, I mean, technically he's the only one who runs against Washington. Because he comes in second, according to the Constitution, Adams becomes vice president. Yes, you heard that right. The U.S. Constitution says in 1787 that whoever comes in second in the presidential election will become vice president. Huh. Imagine that. Well, sneak preview coming attractions. The founders, the government realizes very, very quickly having the second place person be the vice president can lead to all sorts of problems down the road. So we're going to change that here in a couple of years. So now we have a government, we have a president, we have a country. Yay! And we're done for the day. Take care, Panthers.